how I got into journalism and podcast producing. So I thought I'd go into kind of a little bit about my journey and how I got into it, and I guess really where I'm at the moment. So I started my career in journalism in 2016. I got a place on the digital journalism apprenticeship that the BBC do. They do lots of different apprenticeships now, but at the time, that I think that was only the second year that they'd done the apprenticeship. And it was 7 placements based all in different local radio stations. So I was based at Three Counties Radio, and it was just a fantastic time to be starting in journalism, really, because there was lots going on at the time news wise, and I'd done quite a lot of things for Three Counties beforehand as well. So I'd done a bit of freelancing and I kind of helped them out on projects. So I was almost, well, as I say, I essentially got into my career through the apprenticeship, but had done stuff with the local radio station beforehand. So I was already a little bit like, I knew the people there, and it was quite nice actually to kind of go into the newsroom and be able to almost be taken seriously as a proper journalist, because now I was an apprentice rather than someone who didn't have any qualifications and was just there kind of helping out occasionally. So I got my training, so I got my NCTJ qualification, which is kind of, I guess a lot of people on this call will know about that, having either done it or someone suggested that you should do it. NCTJ qualification is great because it allows you to get your media law, your public affairs, and essentially helps you get jobs in the industry, really. That being said, you don't need it. It isn't kind of, it's not like you're not going to get jobs with it, but I found it quite helpful for me working at the BBC, because obviously I've been able to kind of get my media law, and that's helped me in my editorial decisions as well in my day-to-day job. So during my time as an apprentice, I then started working on a pilot, and I am not ashamed to say that I didn't actually know what a podcast was until I started working on that pilot, because around that time, so it was 2018, that I kind of, at the beginning of 2018, I started working on this pilot because I got an email come through saying, does anyone want to come and work on this podcast? And as I said, I didn't really know what a podcast was at that point, because I feel like podcasting has become a lot more popular in the UK in the last few years, while as America have been doing it for God knows how long. Like, Americans are way ahead of us in terms of podcasting and kind of the big titles as well. When you think of podcasts like This American Life, Serial, Radio Lab, all these kind of big podcasts, a lot of them are American, because they are kind of essentially at least 10 years ahead of us, really. But podcasting in the UK has become a lot more popular in recent years, and obviously BBC Sounds was launched, and strange enough, actually Beyond Today was one of the podcasts that launched when BBC Sounds came available. So it was kind of at a point where BBC was starting to realise how popular podcasting was, and because previously I think we'd done podcasts, but they were all like programmes where they condensed the radio programme into a podcast rather than original content, if that makes sense. So it's essentially become a lot more popular. And then in 2018, I moved into the BBC News podcast unit, and we've made podcasts like The Next Episode, which was aimed at kind of more underserved youth audiences, Americast, and Newscast, which is where I currently work. So now we're moving on to how to make your own podcast, which and obviously a lot of this will apply if you want to get a job in the podcast industry as well, but I thought it might be better to talk about how to make your own podcast, because obviously, one, that gives you great experience, and if you want to apply for jobs, you can say, well, look, I'm already making my own podcast anyway, so I know how it works. But also, you might just want to make your own content, and I know lots of journalists and podcast producers who will work for an organisation, BBC, ITV, Channel 4, making podcasts for them or making content for them, but they'll have their own podcasts as well, because it's a great way of essentially kind of, I guess, letting people know about your brand, letting people know about who you are as a person, and a great way to kind of get your skills up as well, because obviously it allows you to make your own content. And I guess it's like essentially when we were all making YouTube channels and creating our own videos. It's kind of, you know, you learn those skills as you go on and make your own content. So I think there's like 3 key points to making a podcast. And the great thing about podcasting is also the reason why many people don't like it. Because essentially with podcasting, anyone can make a podcast, right? So you can go out and you can record, you can edit it together, you can put it out on a hosting website, and you can make your own podcast. But there's a difference between being able to just make one and make a good one. And that is kind of what I'm going to be talking about in this presentation, really, is the difference between kind of, you know, just putting something out and kind of, you know, because I think we've all seen recently, especially on TikTok, with these kind of these men who make their own podcasts where they're just sitting there chatting to their friends, and you're just thinking, what is the point of this podcast? So yeah, essentially that's something that is amazing about podcasting, but also potentially is quite frustrating as well, the fact that anyone can make one and you don't necessarily have to make a good one. So I think with the key points to making a great podcast is, first of all, sound quality. The quality of your podcast is really important because obviously you want it to sound professional, you want it to sound good. And I personally think you need to invest, if you're going to invest money in making a podcast, your priority should be sound quality over anything else. And then target audience, so working out who your target audience is, and that can help you create content, because obviously you want to create content around your listeners and keep them coming back for more, because once you've got them hooked, they're going to want to come back every week to listen to your podcast. That's another thing as well. You know, when you start creating podcasts, it's really important to be regular. So, you know, if it's posting every week, or you do seasons and you say, right, we're going to post for the next 6 weeks, then have a break, then, you know, next month do another 6 episodes. So that's really important, is kind of that regular content creation. And then USP, so what is your unique selling point? Because as I just said, the podcast market is extremely busy, and there's lots of people who are making podcasts, but you need to think about what is going to stand out. So what can you do within your podcast to make it different from everyone else's? And sometimes actually it's the most niche ideas that do really well, because obviously there's no one else that's going to be doing that podcast, while there's probably hundreds of podcasts talking about, I don't know, for example, dating. There's quite a few dating podcasts. So it doesn't mean you can't do that idea, but just what is different about yours, what makes it unique to the other podcasts that are out there. So record your own podcast, right? So why is sound quality so important? And I think depending on what type of podcast you're creating, because obviously there are different types of podcasts. You've got investigations, you've got kind of, you know, more chatty, casual podcasts where it's more of a discussion. There's lots of different types of podcasts that you can create. But I personally think that having clear dialogue without distractions is very important. Especially when you're recording from a home studio, because obviously a lot of people are not going to be able to afford to rent out a studio to make their podcast. So actually a lot of people are going to be doing it from home, DIY style, and you want to make sure that your quality, the quality of your podcast is as good as it can be. And bad quality sound as well, that can switch the listener off. So I have myself turned off and not listened to podcasts because the quality was just so bad that I was just like, no, I just can't listen to it. It hurts my ears. And I think maybe more so because I'm a podcast producer. So I kind of like pick things apart and think, yeah, they shouldn't have done that. They shouldn't have done this. So yeah, I think that's really important, is that, you know, you don't want the listener to switch off and disengage with your content. And an example, would be wind noise. If you're recording audio, and you don't have any protection on your mic, you know, they call them either a dead kitten or a muff. strange, I know, I don't know why, but it's just that fluffy thing that you keep on the top of the mic when you're filming outside. Or an example would be with your kind of normal USB mics is this pop shield here. So obviously you wouldn't have wind noise inside your house, but you might have a popping if you're too close to the mic. So you need to make sure that, you know, you have that stuff in place to stop that from happening, because as I say, bad quality audio, it doesn't matter so much if it's a little bit, do you know what I mean? If you had a podcast where you went out and recorded a tiny interview as part of that podcast, and maybe there was a little bit of wind noise, and obviously there's not much you can do once you've recorded it, that's not so much of an issue, because as long as the rest of your podcast is fine. But if it is like a continuous issue throughout your audio, that can obviously turn people off, and people won't want to listen to the rest of the podcast. What should I use to record? Now, just a disclaimer, I am not paid by Rode, okay? If Rode want to sponsor me, then they can, all right? But I'm not paid by them, but they do make really good microphones. And the reason why I've put these two Rode mics down, so the Rode USB Mini, I believe, is one of the cheapest out of all of these options. So that is under £100. I think you can get it for about £80, and it's an amazing quality mic. It's fantastic. Like, I know a lot of reporters who use it at the BBC, especially during the pandemic when they weren't able to go into the office. It's an amazing quality mic. And then the Rode NT USB is slightly more expensive, only because it's got the pop shield, and it's also got some other features, so you can basically mess around with it a little bit more than you can the USB Mini. The USB Mini is very much like you plug it in and it's all ready to go, because it's got its own like internal kind of, basically it stops the popping sound, but it's like internally inside the mic, while as this one kind of has its own pop shield. And they're great as well, because you can just plug them into your laptop and you're ready to go pretty much, so you don't have to mess around too much with them. But you can change kind of, there's dials on this one, so it makes it a bit more expensive, because you can change the kind of the sound, and essentially it's got a few more features, which is why it's more expensive. But yeah, I don't work for Rode, but they do make great mics. So those are two really good options, and I think the Rode NT USB is probably about 150, so it's a little bit more expensive. But as I say, if you are going to put money into making a podcast, I would say always invest in your microphone, because everything else you can get for free, essentially. But the mic is, for me, the most important thing, because that's going to be the quality of your podcast, the quality of your audio. And we'll get onto kind of editing softwares later and stuff like that. So obviously I will let you know which things are free, which things are not. Lapel mic as well, that is a good option if you want to kind of record on your phone, because a lot of them you can plug in into your iPhones or whatever phone that you have. The only issue with the lapel mic is that it's probably not going to have exactly the same sound as if you use like a proper microphone. But it's quite good if you want to record things outside, or you want to sit in the same room as the person you're interviewing, your guest. You can just kind of plug it in, attach it to your clothing, and then obviously it doesn't move around either, because you've got the little clip, so that's good. You won't get any rustling noises or any interference. And then we also, at the BBC, we use Zoom recorders and Tascam recorders. And this is more for if you're outside recording. So reporters use these a lot of the time, but they are more expensive. They're more on the kind of higher end, should we say. So I think you're looking about £150 to £200, sometimes a little bit more expensive, depending on the model that you want. Because obviously the higher the spec, the more money that you're going to spend. But they're two good options if you're looking to do stuff outside, or because you can also plug in microphones for your guests inside that recorder, and then you can have like multiple I think you can get an extension that allows you to have more mics, but you can have two mics, so it's like one for you, one for your guest if you're doing stuff at events or whatever. So yeah, those are options. There are obviously lots of other options as well. I mean, I've actually brought a really cheap kind of plug-in USB mic for my, not USB, but like it plugs into my iPhone. And I got that for an interview that I was doing, because basically I hadn't got the BBC stuff in time, and I was recording like around the corner from my house. So I just got this one from, I think it was like Amazon or something, and it cost like 20 quid, and I didn't expect it to be amazing quality, but actually it was all right. So I highly recommend, you know, I don't think, I would say probably test things out and check them beforehand, but actually a lot of the cheap stuff as well is just as good. So yeah, would highly recommend kind of looking around and seeing. And also as well, you know, when you're first starting out, you can just use your like Apple earphones, so you don't have to spend lots of money when you're first starting out. You know, you could just use your iPhone, record things on there, because actually your iPhone mic's really good as well. I say iPhone again, not sponsoring Apple, but you know, I think that actually a lot of people have access to iPhones, but you know, you could use Androids as well. I'm sure have the same kind of quality as well. So yeah, when you're first starting out, you don't have to spend lots of money, but actually these could be an investment if you think that you could make a bit of money from your podcast as well. So where should I record my podcast? So well, it's a bit, I feel like sometimes if people have like their own kind of recording software that they like to use, they can record it straight into there. But actually, if you're talking to a guest, then you might want to have kind of a different system. That means that you can record your guest as well from their end. So these are the two programs that we used when basically when the next episode had to go to us working from home at the beginning of the pandemic, and we weren't able to use studios, and obviously guests weren't able to come in. So you've got Zencastr and you've got CleanFeed, and they're two very similar websites. The standard versions are free, but if you want to have like extra features and you kind of want to upgrade, then you'd pay for that monthly. But you can use them, the standard ones, without having to kind of without having to pay that extra money. So Zencastr records remote interviews in studio quality, and it records audio on both your end and your guest's end as well. So you would send them a link and they can open it up on their computer, and then it records both of your audio, and then it puts them together at the end. So there's also one as well called, I think it's called Jack FM, which people might be familiar with, which is the same kind of idea, but I think that one you can use with mobiles. So you can, if your contributor doesn't have a laptop, because these two will only work on desktop, so you need your contributor to go on there and open that up on a desktop. And also it's slightly better if your contributor either has, actually to be fair, they don't need to have a microphone, but they either an external microphone or a wired pair of headphones, so similar to, I guess, the Apple ones, or you know, the ones that have the mic attached to it, so it's like you're basically like an aeroplane pilot type situation where it's got the mic over here. So yeah, any kind of headphones that have a microphone inside, you'll still get quite a good quality. And because it records on both of your ends, it doesn't record like over the internet, if that makes sense. So you don't get the same kind of, for example, if you record on Zoom, sometimes, or you record an interview anyway on Zoom, sometimes you get a little bit of interference because if the person's internet's not very good, it might drop out. Whereas because it's recording on both of your ends, then actually sometimes the quality is better as well. If your guest doesn't own a desktop, you can simul rec, which sounds like something The Sims eat. I don't know why it's called that, but basically you can record audio from your side and then get your guests to record their audio as well. So how you would do it, or this is how we used to do it at T&E anyway, is that you would put your interview up on Zoom or Skype, and then you would record your interview or your audio, into an iPhone or an iPad, basically like a second device, or you might record it straight into your computer. Because, for example, if you're using Audition or Hinge or whatever, you might record your audio straight into your computer through that. And then you would ask your guests to do the same thing. So get them to have their phone recording or recording into their computer, because obviously some people might have the equipment to do it. And then get them to send it to you afterwards. The only thing with simul rec is obviously you both have to be recording at the same time. So you have to like do a little clap is how I do it, is like get you both to clap at the same time and then start recording, or do a little countdown so that you're recording at exactly the same time. So when you lay those two tracks down next to each other, or on top of each other, should I say, they're both going to be at the same time, if that makes sense. And then if they don't have a second device, you can record on Zoom or QuickTime. Obviously, it's you kind of sometimes you're well, I think the quality is good, but sometimes you might be taking a bit of a chance if you want to do it to kind of broadcast level. Especially with QuickTime I don't recommend. But if you were in the worst case scenario and you need to use that, then that's fine. But also recording on Zoom is not bad either, so it's quite good, especially if they can plug in like an external mic or use their headphones. It's actually quite good, and you're still going to get a similar quality. And yeah, remember to ask your guests to wear wired headphones and or use an external mic if they have one, but obviously not everyone will have an external mic. So recording setup, so this is more for your guest, but essentially, you know, as a presenter, you want to make sure that you've got the right recording environment as well. But I'd say make sure that you're recording in an area that's got soft furnishings, so a bedroom or a living room. And if you're kind of sitting next to, because obviously sometimes you might want to record your guests as well, your guests might be sitting next to a window to get the best lighting. They want to make sure that those, well, actually no, essentially that's not right, because if they close the windows, they're going to be too dark, or they close the curtains are going to be too dark. But anyway, if you're just doing sound, you want them to close the curtains, because you want to make sure that that external noise doesn't come in, especially if you're recording someone in London or something, or Manchester, where there's they might be living next to a busy road or whatever. You want to make sure that you're stopping all that external noise from coming in. And if your microphone doesn't have a pop shield, as I say, the Rode ones can't kind of come with those as part of the mic. But if you've just got a standard microphone and you've not got, you know, a pop shield to stop that popping noise, if you know what I mean. Do you know when you go up to a mic very close and you kind of get that because the microphone's not protected properly, you can get two cushions and basically place them in a V shape. So like even just your you know, your pillows that you use on your bed, you can literally just place them right next to the microphone, have your microphone in the middle, so it's like a V shape, and then your microphone sits in between the two, and that will stop that pop-in noise and stop external, you know, if you're in a room that's a little bit echoey that might not have a lot of furnishings in it, that will also prevent that sound, that kind of echoey sound in the background. This is also quite helpful. So this is a guest guideline that was created by someone on Twitter, and we use this quite a lot, as I say, during the beginning of the pandemic. So we'd send this to guests so that they knew kind of how to record, and because we used to get quite a lot of voice notes as well. So we would send this to people who were recording voice notes, because there's a little bit about basically how to set up and make sure that your phone, when you're recording, is kind of you're not going to be disturbed. So there's a little bit about turning your plane to airplane mode, because that is honestly the worst thing when you're recording a voice note and you get a call and then it either stops recording or it like breaks it up and it doesn't sound very good. And if you're doing live interviews as well, that can be quite annoying if you get a phone call halfway through. So yeah, turn your phone to airplane mode, and then it also lets them know about opening the sound recording app and kind of how to hold the phone as well, because actually sometimes it's quite good either to use a pair of headphones, as I say, a wide pair of headphones, or to actually just hold the phone to your ear like you would do if you're having a normal conversation, because obviously the way that the microphone's placed on your phone means that actually just holding it to your ear is, you know, that you're going to get quite good quality. Or you can actually get them to place their recording device on a stack of books, so just having like 3 or 4 books, so it's like near enough to their mouth that the recording sounds good, but you're not getting that kind of poppy distorted sound if they're too close to the mic. And yeah, it also lets them know about saving it and how they can send it to you as well. So that is the URL if anyone wants to copy that down, or I might be able to put it in the chat as well. That's helpful. But yeah, I think this is really good if you have guests, you want to create a podcast where you have to send the guests this kind of little guideline to follow. It's quite handy to have. And then editing software. So these are kind of, I guess, the more popular editing softwares for podcasts. Audacity is free. Everyone's probably heard of Audacity or used it at one point. It is a little bit basic. It's a bit of a basic bitch, but it is very good. And if you, as I say, if you want to invest in your podcast at this point, I would say invest your money in the recording. So invest it in the microphone and use free software, because the editing software is probably the thing that I would spend the least money on. Hindenburg is amazing. We used Hindenburg on the next episode. It's really user friendly. And sometimes I find with like Adobe Audition, and I've not used Pro Tools before, but I know that it's quite similar to Adobe. But it looks quite complicated sometimes when you see it kind of laid out. While as programs like Hindenburg, Audacity, even GarageBand as well, which obviously if you've got a Mac is free, it's very simple. And sometimes keeping it simple is the best. There's a reason why Final Cut X is so simple and so user friendly, because actually I think sometimes you don't need to overcomplicate things. So I would say that some of these are actually a lot easier to use than others, and maybe you could start off using Audacity or Hindenburg you do have to pay for, but as I say, it's so user friendly and so easy to use. So you could start off maybe using Audacity, GarageBand, and then once you start to see some revenue from your podcast potentially, or you decide that you want to invest a little bit more in your podcast, you could upgrade and go for something like Pro Tools or Adobe Audition, which is obviously a little bit more expensive. And then promoting your podcast and brand. So I would say the 3 points for this is designing your logo. So Adobe Illustrator or websites like Canva. Canva is free. As I said earlier, it's amazing. There's lots of different things. And obviously there are options you have to pay for, but a lot of the stuff on there is free. So you can make your own logo for your podcast and you don't have to pay any money for that. I think with podcast logos, you want to stand out, but you also want to keep it simple as well. And I wouldn't go crazy, because sometimes you look at these podcasts, either a podcast logo looks really cheap and a little bit tacky, or it's just like all over the place and it's a bit like, whoa, that's too much. It looks great, but also it looks quite busy and yeah, hurts your head when you look at it. So I'd keep it simple, but yeah, if you want to stand out, then I think Canva's got some great options, and obviously Adobe Illustrator as well. If you're a little bit more into that design side and the graphics, etc., that might be a little bit better. And then deciding where to host your podcast. So there's lots of podcast hosting websites, and a lot of them are free as well, which is great. So Podbean, Acast, Anchor, Buzzsprout, and SoundCloud. And then you can paste your link to the RSS feed into Spotify and Apple. And then that's how you get your podcast onto those platforms. So you need a hosting website first, but then you can post it on there so that your podcast will be available on those platforms as well. And then social pages. I think it's so important to promote your podcast and get the word out there on socials. I mean, we've seen it in recent years, a lot of, or in the last year or so, TikTok has been kind of the perfect place for people to promote their podcast, because they'll clip up little bits and then they'll put it out on social, and people are like, oh great, I want to listen to the whole of the episode, and they'll go and they'll find your podcast. So yeah, I think it's really important to interact with your listeners, get regular feedback so that you can adapt your podcast and make sure it sounds the best that it can be, and really get that feedback from the people who are engaging, and basically, essentially, if you make money out of it, getting you money. So there we go. Answer the questions. I don't know how long that was. Was that long, or did I just kind of go through that quite quickly?
No, that was great. It was a nice pace, covered everything, not a lot of rambling. It was all good. I can see we've got a hand up, so if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the cute presentation, Wesley. I was going to ask, you said there was a mic that you use from Amazon, which is sort of the cheaper quality for £20, but it's quite good. Do you know which mic that is, possibly, please?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think what it was called now. I think what did I type in? I think I just typed in like USB mic, or I think it was like something like iPhone mic, and then it comes up because there's lots of do you know, it's one of those products where lots of different companies will make like the same thing, but essentially it's kind of they just put their branding on it or whatever. So I literally just went on Amazon and I typed that in, and I think it was like the first one that came up. I looked at the one with the best reviews, and it was literally, it's like a tiny little silver mic. I'm not even sure I have it anymore, but I remember I bought it for that particular reason. And it was like a little tiny little silver mic with you got a little muff with it as well, because obviously the muff's really important. And I think it was like, as I say, 20 quid or something ridiculous, so it wasn't a lot of money at all. And then I literally just did this one interview, and I think it was for an episode of Beyond Today, actually. Yeah, it was the one about mental health that I did, and it was all right quality. It was quite good. So something like that, as I say, it's kind of, it's quite cheap, it's cheerful, it's you know, it does what it says on the tin, and actually I don't think you have to pay loads and loads of money for this equipment. And the only reason I kind of was talking about the Rode mics and stuff, I think, is because if you want to do it in your own bedroom, I think the USB mics are probably the best way to go. But if you're going out and about and doing stuff, then yeah, a mic like that where you can just plug it into your phone is really good. But if I find it, if you drop me a message on social media, I'll try and find it for you, and I can send you a link if that's helpful.
Yeah, that'd be great. Also, I'll pop another mic on there and ask for your thoughts, because I had one in mind, and the other one I've wanted to ask about is one that I kind of place on my Canon camera. I think it's the Rode Video Micro.
Oh, yes.
Now, the only issue I have with that is due to the output. It's hard to, because initially I have to put it into a headphone jack, so it's an issue with the TRS and TRS converters, which I can't find. But I'll message you on social media for that. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. And I think that actually I was going to mention that even with editing software, I mean, I've got Final Cut X, and I spent quite a lot of money, because Final Cut X, if anyone knows, is not cheap. And I spent quite a lot of money on that when I first started on the apprenticeship, just so I had it on my own MacBook, and I could use it kind of on my course. And you can edit audio on there as well. You know, so if you've already got video editing software that you've paid quite a lot of money for, or you know, you've got sound equipment for cameras and stuff, you can use that. I kind of, with the microphones, I think it's slightly different, because obviously those microphones for your cameras are kind of built so that you can get quite close up with that camera and you can get that sound. While as I feel like with podcasting, obviously sometimes you want it to be, you know, you want something like, as I say, a microphone with a pop shield, so you can kind of get the best quality. The thing is, it's like, you know, you don't have to have lots of money to do this stuff now, and I think that's why it's so great, is that you can kind of, you know, anyone can do it regardless of your background or where you come from. And I think that's the good thing about it, and the reason why I love it so much. Thank you. No worries. Thank you for your question.
We've had a couple more in the chat. So Briley has said, I'm looking to do sorry, I had a mind blank. I couldn't read the word placement. A work placement at a podcast, but have no experience at all. What general journalism skills or experience might I have that are relevant, like research or writing? And what would be the best things I could learn or get some experience in before starting?
So I think with podcasting, there's lots of transferable skills, right? So there's lots of things that I think are not specific to podcast production, if that makes sense. So when I moved from local radio into podcasting, I'd already done radio production. You know, I'd produced the lunchtime show. I'd also done digital videos as well. So I'd produced digital videos for social media, and a lot of the skills are very similar. That being said, radio is not podcast, and podcasts are not radio. The great thing about podcasting is that you can customize your content for your listeners, right? So if I turn on Radio 1, I'm just going to hear, you know, Greg James or Scott Mills, and I'm not going to be able to kind of choose what I want to listen to. which is, you know, for most of the time, that's fine. But if I'm looking for something very specific, I will go to podcasts, right? Because podcasts, you know, you're able to cater things for a particular audience, and you're able to talk about certain things that you might not be able to talk about on any other platform. And I think that a lot of the transferable skills, I'm kind of thinking about what I do on a day-to-day basis on newscast, and I write briefs for the presenter, so writing skills. I edit audio and I edit clips, so being able to kind of you know, you don't need to be able to mix everything perfectly and be able to kind of, you know, put the music in at the right places and do all that, but just having like basic editing skills is really helpful, and that's why stuff like Audacity is quite good, because it's free, and obviously you don't need to spend lots of money, and you can do that at home to get your editing skills up. Interview skills, you know, although I don't necessarily conduct the interview, I have to do pre-interviews with people, so obviously it's good to be able to kind of use my interview skills to be able to kind of understand what that person's going to say when they come on the podcast. And then I think as well, there's lots of different elements to being a journalist as well, isn't there? And I'm a journalist as well as a podcast producer, so the technical stuff, great, but also you need to be able to have those journalistic skills as well, and communication is a big part of it, and I think that there are lots of things that you can transfer, as I say, you know, those writing skills, as you mentioned, that's really important, and I think before you go, just listen to loads of podcasts. That's kind of the best bit of advice that I can give is just listen to as many podcasts as you possibly can, and listen to bad ones, listen to good ones, and just kind of get an idea. Because as I say, before I started working on the pilot for Beyond Today, I didn't know a lot about podcasting, and I didn't listen to any podcasts really. And then in those first few weeks that we started to work on the pilot, we would have homework, so we'd go and we would listen to, you know, different podcasts to get an idea of what they sounded like and what worked and what didn't, and then we would give like an analysis and say what we thought worked and, you know, what we thought maybe we could use in our own podcast, and I actually think that is the best thing that you can do. And still now I'm constantly listening to different podcasts and different bits of content, so that I can work out what works and, you know, what I can learn from that production. So yeah, that's what I would say. Listen to as many podcasts as you possibly can, get an idea of like what's already out there, you know, what works, what doesn't, and try and see if you can maybe, you know, and also ideas are currency. You probably hear this sort of, you know, in a lot of conversations with people in the journalism industry, but ideas are currency. So if you have ideas for treatments, you know, you might not have a story idea, but you might have a way of doing things, or you think that there should be a different way of producing this particular podcast that you think might work better. Or maybe that podcast that you're working on doesn't have a social presence, and you go in there and you say, well, wait a minute, you should be doing TikTok videos. Why don't you do, you know, a TikTok video every day promoting the podcast? Just going in and having those ideas, as I say, is, I think, really important, and will get you far. And people love people with ideas, basically. And no idea is a shit idea either. You know, if you've got lots of ideas, people will love you regardless of whether, you know, 1 out of 5 is actually a good idea. So
I'm going to agree with that, because I think even if you don't think your idea is good, if you pitch it, you can workshop it a little bit in the team that you're in and like turn it into something that eventually is something that gets pitched. I'm going to ask quickly if, Georgia, you can stop screen sharing so I can the one I post this afterwards, and then we'll get back to the questions.
There we go. Hopefully that's that sorted that out.
All good. So Hema has asked, did you get your BBC experience straight after ending school or after a degree? Like, what point of your career was it at?
Yeah, so I went to college for 2 years. So I kind of worked out that I wanted to be a journalist when I was, well, actually, I think I've wanted to be a journalist since I was about 6 years old, because I used to carry around this little recorder and record little interviews with my guinea pigs and, you know, the dog next door, and make my own little radio shows on this little cassette recorder. But I didn't know what a journalist was. You know, I'm from a working class family. I don't have any connections to the industry. I didn't really know what it was to be a journalist. But I realized that actually my personality was very suited to this industry, because I'm someone who's very curious. I want to know what's going on. I'm very much like, I like to speak to people, and I want to hear people's stories. So I think that kind of lent itself to that industry. But then I didn't actually realize that I truly wanted to be a journalist probably until I was about 15, 16. And I just finished my GCSEs. I went and did my AS levels for a year. Didn't do very well in my in my exams. I took it as a bit of a chance to mess about, really, and be a bit of an idiot. So I messed about, didn't do very well in my exams, and then I ended up seeing this creative media course in the local college, and I was like, okay, that sounds like something I really want to do, because one of the units was journalism, and then there was like video production and, you know, making music videos and adverts, etc. So I was like, okay, that sounds like something I want to do. So I went to college for 2 years. The plan was always to go to university in my second year. So I'd done my UCAS application, kind of, you know, send that off. And then I went through quite a big bereavement in my life, and lost my brother when I was 19. And it was obviously completely derailed my plans, and kind of ended up in a situation where I was originally going to move away and go to university, but then felt like I couldn't, because it was such a kind of big change that had happened in my life, and it was like, well, I don't really want to move away from home at this current time. So I did actually end up going to university. I went to a local university instead, so I could stay at home. But it wasn't a good idea, because I had to drop out after a year, because I wasn't in the right mindset, basically. And looking back, I mean, hindsight's a great thing, but I wouldn't be where I am today had I not made the choices that I did at that time. But yeah, I had to drop out of university, and was really disappointed, because I assumed that, oh, you know, I'm not going to be a journalist now. I'm not going to get into the media industry, because there is that assumption. I don't think there's as much of an assumption now, but I think when I was younger, it was very much like, oh yeah, you have to have a degree to get into this industry. And now it's like lots of people I know, and lots of very talented people as well, they don't have degrees, and they've been able to work their way into the industry, either through apprenticeships, trainee schemes, or just like freelancing. So I ended up kind of taking I ended up taking a few jobs here and there, kind of doing some essentially it was marketing, but it wasn't really marketing. It was just like helping local businesses with their websites and stuff, which is why I got a lot of my kind of DIY skills in that sense, making websites and kind of doing their marketing, and, you know, so it wasn't that far removed really from journalism, but obviously wasn't what I wanted to do, because it was very much about sales and promotion and stuff, and I wasn't really down for that. So I ended up doing some work experience at Three Counties Radio, which is where I did my apprenticeship. And I did 2 weeks of that, and just decided there's no way you're going to get rid of me. I'm going to chain myself to this building. Do you know what I mean? I'm literally just going to, you know, you're going to have to pull me away from the building to get rid of me, because I just loved it so much, and just felt it was very me. And it was one of those things where when you do what you love, it's almost like that realization of like, oh my God, this is exactly what I've been waiting to do. Do you know what I mean? And every day you wake up and you enjoy what you do, and you don't feel like it's a job. Like sometimes you're like, I'm getting paid to do this. This is mental. But yeah, so I did some work experience, and then conveniently the apprenticeship came up a few months later, and my editor said, I feel like you should apply for this, because that way you're going to get your qualification, because obviously I didn't have any qualifications at that point, and you can get your work experience and your training as well. And then yeah, so I applied for it, and I think that year there was quite a few people that applied. I think there was like 1,000 people. and didn't really expect to get it, if I'm honest with you, but then got the call saying, oh yeah, do you want to come and, you know, be an apprentice at Three Counties? And yeah, did that for 22 months, and as I say, then went straight into podcasting, really. So that's, yeah, my journey into it.
I love that. And it's nice. I think it's very important for everyone to know that you definitely do not need a degree to work in this industry. We've had a couple more questions in from Howard saying, how do I search far and wide to ensure my podcast isn't already out there? Just if you want to do something unique. And how do you monetize podcasts?
Yeah, so I think with trying to work out, you know, if there's any other podcasts that are similar to yours, I think that it's all about kind of an extensive search sometimes of Google, kind of just Googling, first of all, the name, because obviously that is quite difficult. The name is actually, I think, the most difficult part when you're researching, because the amount of times, for example, like our podcast, The Next Episode, if you Google it, it comes up with the Dr. Dre song. So, you know, in hindsight, I mean, it's discontinued now, but in hindsight, you know, maybe we should have thought about that. But, you know, sometimes you'll go for an idea. Same with Beyond Today. If you Google Beyond Today, there's like a Christian podcast as well, which has the same name. So I think the name is really important. So Googling around, finding out if there's any podcasts with a similar name to yours. And what I do is I tend to look on like Apple, you know, go Google it, but also directly look on Spotify and Apple to see if there's anything that maybe hasn't like popped up when you do your Google search, because sometimes the SEO can be a bit kind of messed up. But sometimes it's a podcast that has like hardly any listeners, or maybe they stopped making regular content, so you can actually just kind of not steal the name, but you know what I mean, you can have the name because you know that not lots of people won't be directed to that podcast, if that makes sense. But yeah, like extensive Googling, kind of looking and seeing what else is out there in the category as well. So if you're, for example, doing an investigation podcast and you want to investigate multi-level marketing companies, that's quite a good idea, you know. Just come up with an idea for a podcast. No one better steal this idea. No, I'm joking. So like, for example, if you wanted to do something on that, you would type in and see on Apple, you would go into investigations and see like what investigations are out there about similar topics. And sometimes it's really difficult because you can easily, because the market is so oversaturated, you can easily miss it. But kind of that's why I always think, really start thinking about how your podcast is unique and how you can make your podcast different, because as I say, it doesn't mean that you can't do that idea, but you just have to make it a little bit different, and you have to make it stand out from the ones that are out there already. So hopefully that's helpful. But also on the monetizing situation, I can't really speak too much about that, because obviously at BBC we don't monetize our podcasts. That being said, a lot of the people that I know that have their own podcasts will get sponsors, and they'll get sponsors from, you know, local companies, or they'll get sponsored, you know, you often hear it, don't you, when you're listening kind of like to not so much British podcasts, but I know that there's kind of with the American podcast, they obviously team up with, you know, BetterHelp and all these kind of like, you know, different places. And I think there is actually a website where you can go on there and you can kind of apply to be sponsored by some of these companies. I'll try and see if I can find it, but I remember listening to a podcast the other night and they were talking about it. So hopefully that's a little bit helpful. Sorry, I can't speak too much on that, but I think sponsorship is probably the way to go.
I feel like I've had the same thing around it, and also completely relate to that first question. I've been sitting on a podcast idea for like 2 years now, and every time someone is announcing they're starting a new podcast, I internally crap myself, because I'm like, that's going to be my idea.
Yeah, because you're waiting, aren't you? You're kind of thinking like you've got this amazing idea and you're really like pushing it and you want to put it out there, but sometimes it's really difficult, isn't it? Because you can't get kind of you can't get the buy-in, and you kind of
even finding the time.
Exactly, yeah. And that's a big thing as well, is you know, people need to be aware of the fact that we have this like I'm very anti-hustle culture, because I don't think it's healthy. I don't think it's healthy to constantly be like, right, look, if you want to do that, fine, absolutely grand, but it don't feel like you have to have like a podcast, a YouTube page, be doing TikTok videos, but like be everywhere and doing everything all at the same time. If you've got an idea and you want to make it happen, concentrate your efforts on that, and don't be worrying that you have to be like doing this at the same time and doing that at the same time and juggling lots of different projects. Sometimes you do you know what I mean? I do it in my job. I've kind of, as I say, always got things on the side that I'm doing, but I also try not to, because sometimes you end up like not having time off, especially if you're freelancing. I imagine that's really difficult because you're constantly just taking on jobs here or there and everywhere. So yeah, like, just if you've got an idea, concentrate on that and just, try and make it happen. I know sometimes it's difficult, it's really difficult, but yeah, it's one of those things, I think. And podcasting, as I say, the great thing about it is that if you wanted to make your own idea, you could. Also, to add to that, on monetizing, you can also get maybe a charity if your podcast is related to, for example, if you want to do something about grief, or you want to do something about mental health. Sometimes charities will allow you to kind of use their logos and use their backing, or maybe have a little pot of money where they can kind of help you create that. So yeah, reaching out to maybe like local organizations, charities, businesses, that might be the way to go.
Yeah, great tip. And on like the whole putting your efforts in one thing, I'm going to quote Parks and Recreation. It's better to whole-ass one thing than half-ass multiple things. We've got, so there's one last question in the chat and then I'm going to ask one. So Charlotte has asked, or she said, I'm in regional radio at the moment, looking to make that leap into podcasting and finding it difficult. Do you think it's worth creating my own podcast to bolster my application, even if my listener/follower numbers are low?
Answer to that is yes. I think that actually a big part of the reason why I got my job, so when I got my apprenticeship, blogging was, well, it still is quite big, but I feel like podcasting has obviously taken over a little bit now, and it's all about podcasting and TikTok and kind of having a social media presence. But when I started my apprenticeship, before I started, actually, I had a blog, and I'd write my own stuff in there about mental health and grief and lots of different subjects on my blog. And that was my way of, first of all, continuing to do what I love and staying passionate, but also when I got my apprenticeship, or when I went for my interview, I was able to say, well, look, I'm already doing it. Kind of, I'm already making my own content. I'm already looking at all these issues. And I just remembered something as well. So when I first got my apprenticeship, they asked you to, part of the application was writing an article. And so I wrote an article which was about the Gypsy Roman traveller community in the local area and kind of the issues with housing and education, etc. And weirdly, I've done loads on the community since, and it wasn't because I remember doing that article, but it's just really strange how that's done a full circle. And I've done lots and lots about this community after getting my job because I wrote an article about this community. And I think it kind of shows that if you've already got stuff that you're doing, that was a slight detour, sorry, but if you're already doing stuff that kind of shows that you are passionate about what you do, that can be really helpful. And I asked the other year someone from the BBC recruitment for the apprenticeships, I said, what is it that you're looking for when you kind of look for people? What is it that stands out to you? And it's like, they get people constantly saying, I love journalism, I'm really passionate about journalism. But why? Why are you passionate about it? Like, what are you doing to show that you're passionate about it? And if you have your own podcast, if you're working in local radio, first of all, that's amazing anyway, because you have the connections, and I think local radio is one of the best places to start, because you kind of you make those connections and you get those skills that you wouldn't get if you were just kind of thrown into the deep end working on, like, say, Radio 1 or whatever. But I feel like actually to be able to say you make your own podcast, you have the editing skills. It doesn't matter. I don't personally think it matters how many people listen to it. The great thing about podcasts is no one knows how many listeners you have. Obviously you might have like not many reviews, and I guess people work it out through that, but you don't have to tell people how many listeners you have. You can just say, look, I've got my own podcast, I've got editing skills, I make it myself, I've created the artwork for it, I'm showing you that I'm already doing this and I'm passionate about this. So yeah, highly recommend having your own, if you want to be a writer, having your own blog, you want to go into podcasting or radio, having your own podcast. And the way that it is now, anyone can do it, and I think that's why it's so great, is it's very accessible no matter how much money you have, or basically what background you come from.
Yeah, definitely. And it's, if people are curious about crafting or creating their own opportunities, there will be a masterclass on that in a few weeks. So I have a quick question.
We love it.
When you're starting a podcast and you don't have any connections, but you want more high profile guests, how do you go about kind of contacting or booking people like that?
Yeah, I think we have the added bonus that at Newscast we've obviously got the numbers, and we've got quite big names, Laura Kuensberg, Adam Fleming, Chris Mason. We kind of have these big names that draw people in, because people are like, oh yeah, I know this person, and people are quite interested. So we kind of have the added bonus of that. And I think also it helps when you work for an organization that people see it and they go, oh yeah, I want to get involved in that. That being said, I know people who have just started their own podcast who have actually got quite big names on there. I know someone who had a podcast, and literally the second episode they got Davina De Campo, the drag queen, to come on there, and I was like, that's amazing, like that's really, really good. Actually, sometimes I feel like, depending on the guest, a lot of people were actually really interested to do podcasts, right? And the reason is because with podcasting is you have all this time, and that's why podcasts are so great, because it kind of allows you to have time that you wouldn't have if you were doing like a news story on the 6 and the 10 o'clock news or whatever, or you were doing kind of an article, because there's only so much that you can put into that, right? But with an hour long podcast, or even like a 20-30 minute podcast, you can go over quite a lot of grounds and you can talk about lots of different issues and topics. And so if you sell it to people like that, and you say, right, listen, this is a chance for you to sit down and talk about the things that you're passionate about, and kind of open up and kind of talk about all these different things, a lot of the time people are quite interested in that. And I feel like it depends on who you're reaching out to, and also I guess that kind of the way that you word it. And I think actually when you say to people, look, listen, on this podcast you can talk about what you want, well, within reason, and you can do a real deep dive into all these different issues and topics, people are quite interested in that, and it's a good way to sell yourself, I think.
Nice, it's very helpful to know. One very final quick question. How was asked, can producing pay off full-time as a presenter in it? So I guess that means just, I don't know, like presenting a podcast, or maybe working. Actually, I don't want to ask the wrong question. Howard, do you mind clarifying? You can go off mute and ask it yourself.
Hey, I'm so sorry. Look at me just piling all the questions in it. Sorry. Right, basically, so let's say if I'm doing an individual podcast, so not alongside a company like Global, I'm starting my own podcast up. By the time I get all these sponsors, will it ever, I mean, I don't know if you'll know this, but will it ever be able to finance me like as a full-time, do you know what I mean? Would it pay full-time? Could it ever? With podcast always a part-time thing?
I think it depends, and I think it's the idea, right? Because for example, if you think about something like Griefcast, to my knowledge, Griefcast started as kind of like, its own small podcast. I don't think that they were making like massive amounts of money out of it to begin with. But as it's become more popular, obviously BBC Sounds hosted it as well, and lots of other different places were hosting it. And I guess obviously you have to pay to host things, you can't just take someone's podcast and just put it on your platform. So my instinct is to say that yes, that I think you could eventually. I think the only annoying thing about podcasts is, as I say, because the market is quite oversaturated, that makes it a little bit more difficult, because obviously lots of people are trying to make money out of the same thing. But that being said, if you have a really good idea, and I know people who they'll make their podcast themselves, but then they'll they'll send it over to like BBC Sounds, or they'll send it over to a commissioner in a podcast production company, and say, is this of interest? Do you want to make a second series, or do you want to help me develop this idea, or do you want to host it? And they're kind of almost like getting that backing from other people. So I think you can. It's difficult, but if you have the right idea, I think eventually it can pay off.
Thank you.
But yeah, so fingers crossed. I feel like, manifesting it, putting it out there, hopefully.